If you're an empath, this video is for you. As some TikToks are taking far too seriously,
this is why you should never lie to an empath.
If you are an empath, you're gonna understand exactly what I mean by this. I know when people are lying to me.
And as other satirical trends are calling out, empathy is a complicated thing, and some people who think of themselves as empaths might not be empathetic at all. So what is empathy all about? Life is Strange True Colours might seem like it takes being an empath very literally, but it has a lot more depth than you might think based on the premise. Life is Strange True Colours is an episodic game which tells the story of Alex Chen, a 21-year-old Chinese-American woman who was separated from her brother Gabe and has been living in the foster care system for years. When Alex and Gabe are reunited, he asks her to move to his new hometown of Haven Springs, Colorado. In the first episode, Gabe's stepson Ethan runs off to play unsupervised in an abandoned mining site at the time a blast has been scheduled. Gabe calls to let Typhon, the company responsible, know that there is a child and 3 other people in the blasting site searching for him. The group manages to save Ethan, but for some reason the blast goes off anyway, killing Gabe. The rest of the game follows Alex's efforts to find out who is responsible for Gabe's death, and why. Oh, but of course, it's a Life is Strange game, and as anyone familiar with the series will know, there's always a supernatural element involved. Indeed, Alex has a superpower, or a curse depending on how the player as Alex chooses to see it, the power of empathy. She can feel what other people are feeling, which is represented in the game by her hearing their thoughts and seeing colourful auras which surround them, with particular colours representing particular emotions. Alex uses this power to solve the mystery of Gabe's murder, as well as trying to help people along the way. But if their feelings are too intense, Alex can become overwhelmed by them and act out in ways she might normally not. The game challenges the player to question whether it's your place to decide what other people need, and whether sacrificing your own needs really is the best way to help others. This most recent installment in Game Assist's favourite video game series raises a lot of questions. What is emotional labour? What do race and gender have to do with it? And how do systems of social care under capitalism fail the most vulnerable and oppressed among us? Get comfy, grab yourself a drink and a snack, and get ready to lift the lid on Life is Strange True Colours with us. We know we literally always say this, but it's going to be a long one. But hopefully we'll hold your attention better than the Batman. Hi, and welcome to Game Assist. I'm Daz, my pronouns are they, them.
And I'm Sarah. My pronouns are they, them, and she, her.
Before we dive into this whopper of a video essay, make sure you're subscribed and have the notification bell turned on to find out when we post. If you really like what we do, consider joining our Patreon community. We have rewards from just £1 a month and it helps us to keep doing what we're doing. Alternatively, if a one-off payment would be better for you, consider buying us a coffee on Ko-fi. All of our links are in the description. This video will, of course, contain spoilers for Life is Strange True Colours. If you haven't played the game already, we really recommend you check it out before hearing what we have to say about it. There are also minor references to Life is Strange and Life is Strange Before the Storm. And finally, before we get stuck in, please be mindful of the following content warnings. This video essay will contain discussions of and depictions of sexual violence and abuse, physical abuse, xenophobia, racism, child abuse, blood and needles, and death and grief.
We've only got one key concept for you in this video, but it's a pretty big one, so buckle up. Work isn't the same for everyone. Labour is divided unequally. Different people have to do different kinds of work and different amounts of work for different levels of compensation. These labour divisions are organised on the basis of gender, race, and class. We know that housework is still very much seen and organised as women's work, and women are overrepresented in caring professions like nursing. At the same time, while white women are girl bossing it up, this is only possible because of the exploitation of other, usually racialized women. The white CEO of a fashion company gains her wealth and power by exploiting women of color in the global south, working 12 or more hours a day, 7 days a week, making garments for as little as $1 an hour. The girl boss doesn't actually have to balance family and career. She can employ migrant women of color on poverty wages to do the housework and look after her children for her. The need for women's work, caring and domestic labor, doesn't just go away. It only gets increasingly displaced from rich white women onto poor racialized women, both locally and globally. How do we understand the way gender, race, and class organize labor? The first thing that comes to mind, I'm sure, is the word intersectionality. A now popular term, intersectionality was coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. The concept is that different systems of oppression intersect like roads do at intersections. In America, anyway, who knows what British roads are doing. The concept of intersectionality, unsurprisingly as it is Crenshaw's area of expertise, is rooted in legal rights and legal frameworks. She notes that the United States law accounts for women and for black people respectively, but not for black women. The aim was to get the law to reflect that black women have distinct experiences. Intersectionality is a useful concept in the sense that, yeah, many people have vastly different experiences of, say, being a woman, depending on whether they're racialized, queer, disabled, or all of the above. But, as folks like Patricia Hill Collins have begun to argue, the term is limited precisely because of the intersection metaphor. For two roads to meet at an intersection, that would mean that, for example, racism and misogyny are totally separate and distinct entities, and they only meet at a single point. Collins uses the term matrix of domination instead, describing systems as interlocking with one another. David McNally takes this one step further, arguing that the matrix metaphor is still limited. After all, for two or more things to interlock, they must still exist separately. They must meet at multiple points instead of just at one, like an intersection. McNally offers this critique. Perhaps because intersectionality originates in legal theory, with its foundational doctrine of discrete and autonomous legal subjects who possess property and rights, it regularly finds itself trapped within an atomism that even its most sophisticated proponents seek to escape. Instead, he argues that it's more adequate to understand how oppression works through an organic metaphor. For a body to work, its organs must function in tandem, but these organs can't exist on their own. They can only be understood and can only work in relation to one another and to the body as a whole. So, for example, a liver on its own is useless and doesn't make any sense. A liver only works in relation to a heart, which moves substances to and from it through the bloodstream, in relation to kidneys and digestive organs, which precede and follow its role in detoxification and waste removal, and so on. I worked really hard there to remember my A-level biology, so you're welcome. The liver can only do what it does because of its relationship to other organs, and all of this only makes sense in relation to the body as a whole, because, well, if the liver didn't play its part in filtering out toxins, we would die. So, organs can only achieve their purpose in relation to one another, in order to serve the ultimate purpose of keeping the body alive and doing what it's doing. Even more than that, when something in the body changes or works differently, for example, if you have one kidney instead of two, the organs will adapt to keep the body alive and working, but in a different way. Living systems are all informed by purposes, and the same is true for social collectives like the family and the state. Just like the liver, heart, and kidneys, capitalism, racism, disableism, and gender systems are co-constituted. They make one another work, and they can't work properly without each other. They serve the overall purpose of keeping the system that oppresses us alive and working, and they adapt to hardship. For example, capitalism can't work, and never has worked, without colonialism and racism. Equally, modern racism, and I say modern racism because racism in some form arguably did exist before capitalism, but modern racism can only be understood in the context of capitalism, and how racism upholds and enables it. Racism and capitalism aren't separate. Capitalism has also been adapting to increasing awareness and scrutiny around racism in order to survive, by perpetuating the idea that racism is about individual discrimination and exclusion. That makes inclusion into the system not dismantling the system itself, the solution. Corporations, politicians, the military, the system's agents are all telling us now that they care about racism. They want to fight racism, not by ending the exploitation and murder of racialized people and communities that allows them to exist, but by including more racialized people into their ranks. Meanwhile, as people of color are gaining access to the system, as CEOs or entrepreneurs or business owners or whatever, it is at the expense of poor people of color, their communities and their land, both in the global south and in the global north. So, David McNally says that these relations do not need to be brought into intersection because each is already inside the other, co-constituting one another to their very core. Capitalism is racism, is disableism, is misogyny, is queerphobia. Like a really fucked up turducken. Angela Davis's Women, Race and Class is a great example of a text that frames capitalism, racism, and sexism as systematically, more than intersectionally, related. As such, it can be considered a social reproduction text. There it is, the phrase that popped up on the screen a few minutes ago telling you I was going to explain it. I've been talking for a while without actually mentioning social reproduction, right? If systems of oppression are co-constituted, they all are one another, constantly in motion and full of collisions and contradictions like any organism. Social reproduction theory, or SRT for short, is a Marxist feminist framework for understanding how gendered and racialized labor are organized. As Frigga Haug puts it, all gender relations are relations of production, and all production is gender-coded. We could also add that all racial relations are relations of production, and all production is racially coded. Crucially, there are writings on SRT that aren't just about understanding these systems, but about understanding the everyday gendered and racialized realities of life under capitalism. I will note here that there isn't much writing on social reproduction that explicitly addresses disableism, though there could be a lot to say about this when we consider how caring labor, often for the elderly and disabled, is women's work and increasingly racialized. But hey, if you're watching this video and something comes to mind on that, please let us know in the comments. Under capitalism, workers' labor produces all the wealth in society. What Marxists call surplus value, the excess wealth which is the difference between workers' wages and the value of the work they produce, is grabbed up by capitalists. Because capitalists own the means of production, stuff like machinery, tools, and so on that are used to provide commodities for capitalism, workers can't provide for their own lives. Thanks to measures like enclosure movements, when common land that people could live and grow their own food on was seized up and privatized, most workers are unable to grow their own food or build their own homes. They are reliant on wages to survive, as that's the only way they can pay for food and housing. So they have no choice but to produce surplus value, or wealth, for the capitalist in order to obtain wages. Social reproduction theory asks, if workers produce all the wealth in society, who produces the worker? In Marxism, labor power, the capacity to do work, is theorized a bit differently from labor itself. The worker can't do any labor to produce surplus value for capital if they don't have any labor power. What workers sell to the capitalist for wages is not their labor itself then, but their labor power. But how does the worker replenish their labor power as a commodity to sell to capital in order to survive? In other words, how does the worker have the physical, mental, and material ability to work every day, and the day after that, and the day after that? To produce the worker and to replenish their labor power means to meet their needs and desires as necessary to keep them working. For an individual worker, this might mean sleep, food, emotional support, and so on. The labor that the worker produces for capital is referred to as productive labor because it is productive for capitalism, and the work that is done to produce the worker is called reproductive labor because it reproduces the worker's labor power every day. This isn't just relevant on an individual level though, it's also relevant to the working class as a collective. That is to say, individuals have needs and desires, but so do groups. Reproducing the working class as a whole can be understood on a crude biological level, reproducing children, but it can also be understood in other ways. For example, looking after the elderly seems like it would be utterly unimportant to capital. After all, many elderly people don't have much more labor power to give, but communities and families care for their elders, and they want to know that they'll be looked after when they grow old as well. So elderly care is important to reproducing the working class as a whole, just as giving birth to children is. Reproducing the working class as a whole also involves ideological work. People need to buy into capitalism, to believe in it, for it to work. That's why the capitalist myth that everyone can succeed if they just work hard enough still has such a chokehold on so many of us. It gives our suffering meaning, even imbues it with some pleasure. As Catherine Mitchell, Sally A. Marston, and Cindy Katz put it, ideologies about the proper role of the individual at home and work become common sense understandings, as they are entrenched in various kinds of spatial practices and symbols through time. The production of common sense understandings entails a lot of work and is an important part of the work of social reproduction. Productive and reproductive labor are very much gendered. Cooking is women's work. Cleaning is women's work. Childcare is women's work. Elderly care is women's work. A lot of this reproductive labor goes unpaid in our society, or when it is paid, it's extremely low paid and precarious work. In our modern neoliberal capitalist society, while white women are becoming more able to access higher paid, secure productive labor, it's racialized women, often migrant women from the global south, that are taking on the displaced domestic and reproductive work. This racialized division of women's labor isn't new either. Carmen Teeple-Hopkins, in her research which interviews Filipina live-in domestic workers in Montreal, argues that the conditions of live-in domestic workers are similar to the conditions of black women living under slavery. While both black men and women's labor was unwaged and both did field work, black women also did domestic labor, and this feminine labor was devalued. The public and private spheres weren't clearly divided for black women, as they engaged in unpaid work both outside and within the so-called home, the plantations in which they worked and were exploited and abused. Thus, black feminists have deconstructed the neat divisions of home and work time and private and public space. And black feminist tradition not only highlights that current domestic worker employment relations are historically rooted in domestic slavery, but that an emotional sense of home is not necessarily located in a physical house. Not to get too far ahead of myself, but this makes it particularly interesting that Life is Strange True Colors has an emotional core so concerned with what home really means. Social reproduction involves mental, physical, and emotional work which historically, socially, and biologically reproduces the working population. This includes activities, attitudes, behaviors, emotions, responsibilities, relationships. The nuclear family unit is essential to this, but it's not just that. Slavery, immigration, public education, pensions, benefits, healthcare, and leisure are all examples of social reproduction which reproduce the worker, their labor power, and the working class as a whole. However, the line between production and reproduction isn't necessarily as neat as it might appear. Consider that in the modern world, some social reproductive labor is now paid. For example, domestic work, nursing, or teaching. Or how domestic workers might live in their place of employment as black women lived on plantations. In their book Life's Work, Mitchell, Marston, and Katz argue that a lot of existing social reproduction theory is too focused on the theoretical and not focused enough on the everyday. Like a lot of classical Marxist theory, it approaches social reproduction from a philosophical point of view, asking what the form and logic of capitalism is, how it sustains and reproduces itself as an overall system. But Mitchell, Marston, and Katz want to point to the limits of abstract theorizing and provide an embodied view. They're interested in the messy, fleshy nature of what they call life's work. They're interested in its contradictions. How do we live at work and how do we live outside of it? It's important to ask how people survive, but what sustains people and even brings them pleasure? These days, there's more and more blurring between the boundaries of what is and isn't work. We're always told that if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. a statement which assumes that it's impossible for work to bring pleasure. Mitchell, Marston, and Katz point out that the new flexible subjects of late capitalism are the office. Their spheres of domesticity are the factory. We are meant to love our work, and furthermore, our pleasure becomes work not only when we monetize our hobbies, but in multiple other ways. Healthy eating and exercise can feel like work. Taking care of ourselves can feel like work. Taking care of others can feel like work. And these things can all be pleasurable as well. The logic of capitalism permeates every aspect of our lives. Indeed, capitalism wants us to work and produce wealth for capital and limits how we can satisfy our needs in many ways. But at the same time, workers need their physical and emotional needs to be satisfied on some level if they're going to continue to work. So capitalism also needs to be invested to some degree in our pleasure and our satisfaction. Nancy Fraser points out that while social reproduction work is cast as women's work and women's work is devalued, it is essential to society. A tension exists between the fact that capitalism needs social reproduction while also systematically undermining it and attacking it to maximize profits. As such, capitalism experiences periodic crises in social reproduction, or what Fraser calls crises of care. Most Marxists agree that capitalism tends towards periodic economic and political crises, and it's also becoming somewhat more accepted that the ecological crisis is a result of the colonial capitalist exploitation of nature. Add a social reproduction crisis on top of that, and as Fraser says, on the one hand, social reproduction is a condition of possibility for sustained capital accumulation. On the other hand, capitalism's orientation to unlimited accumulation tends to destabilize the very process of social reproduction on which it relies. So capitalism both needs to meet our social reproduction needs, more simply understood as our individual and collective physical and emotional fulfillment, in order for us to work to produce profit, but at the same time it wants to squeeze as much as it can out of us by limiting and attacking our individual and collective social reproduction. This fundamental structural contradiction can help us to understand the messy, fleshy, daily contradictions, frustrations, and pleasures that we experience under capitalism. Capitalism very much uses the carrot and stick. Workers might not have control over the means, conditions, and purpose of their work, but they must be motivated by other factors. Nora Raithzel, Diana Molinari, and Einar Tollefson explore this through interviews with Volvo workers in both global North and South countries. For some women, working in masculine, valued, productive labor increased their confidence. In the face of misogyny on factory floors, they defied men's expectations and proved that they were just as good, if not better. However, most of these women also had reproductive responsibilities, like childcare and cooking, and they only slept for 4 hours or less a night to be able to do it all. Their motivations and tendencies varied for many reasons, but cultural norms were a factor. For example, while Swedish interviewees tended towards an individualistic desire for success and felt that their reproductive labor was an obligation, South African interviewees felt that a sense of reciprocity and moral obligation to care for their elders, as well as their children, motivated them to work. They felt more like their productive labor was the obligation, and their desire to care for others led to self-sacrificing and dependent practices. As Raithzel, Molinari, and Tollefson put it, capitalist forms of production have been successful in colonizing women's and men's desire to do something useful and to take care of others. So it's fair to say that capitalism is full of contradictions and tensions, not just on a structural level, but in terms of how we experience it physically and emotionally in every aspect of our lives. In this essay, we'll be exploring how, in Life is Strange: True Colors, two main plot threads about Alex's empath power and about the mining company Typhon represent production and reproduction under capitalism. How is racialized and gendered productive and reproductive labor organized in the world of True Colors? By discussing Alex and her family, as well as other characters in the game, we ask how the messy, fleshy, everyday reality of life's work is represented in a game very concerned with everyday realities, emotions, and relationships. And we ask how the looming beast of Typhon affects them all.
In Life is Strange True Colors, there are two central plot threads. The first is about the mystery of Gabe's death and the corporation Typhon's chokehold on the small Colorado town of Haven, while the second is about Alex navigating her power of empathy and her relationships with others. As we discussed in our explanation of social reproduction theory, productive work is what produces wealth for capitalism, while reproductive work is necessary for workers as individuals and as a class to reproduce their labour power. Both are essential to upholding capitalism, but productive work is coded as masculine and is more valued, while reproductive work is coded as feminine and is devalued. In Life is Strange True Colors, plot elements about social reproduction, including empathy, as well as social reproduction systems like the nuclear family and foster care system, are very much interwoven with the plot about production. Typhon organises both productive and reproductive labour in Haven Springs, and the violence they are responsible for has deep physical and emotional impacts on Alex and the other residents of the town.
First, let's talk about Alex's power a little more. Before Life is Strange True Colors was even released, I remember myself and others being immediately struck by its protagonist. For a lot of reasons, including queer Chinese American representation and a move away from thinner body types, but in particular, the very premise that she is a queer woman of color with the literal power to feel and shoulder the burden of other people's emotions. We've talked a bit in our other videos about how, in the Life is Strange series, protagonists' superpowers, or lack thereof, operate as metaphors and correlate to personality traits and narrative threads. Socially anxious Max Caulfield gains the power to rewind time and tries to use it to find the perfect solution to everything, but learns the hard way that all actions have consequences and we need to make mistakes and face those consequences in order to grow. Chloe Price, a young mentally ill person on a self-destructive streak, has no supernatural ability, but game mechanics frame her ability to backtalk her way out of any situation as the lifeline between her and a whole lot more trouble, including her own death. Sean Diaz finds himself powerless while his little brother Daniel's powers grow, reflecting the powerlessness he feels as a houseless young man of color trying to step into his father's role at the mere age of 16, and on the run as a racist police state closes in on him. There's probably some temptation to refer to Alex's power of empathy as emotional labor, so let's address this term before moving forward. The term emotional labor has become normalized in the mainstream, but taken far away from its original context. As Emma Spector summarizes for Vogue in wonderfully accessible terms, emotional labor is not what you think it is. The phrase is often incorrectly taken to mean the outsized or otherwise inappropriate work of being a friend or confidant or partner to someone who doesn't value your time, which is a totally valid issue. It's just not the originally designated definition. The phrase emotional labor was actually coined by sociologist Arlie Hochschild in her 1983 book, The Managed Heart: Commercialization of Human Feeling, and refers to a situation where the way a person manages his or her emotions is regulated by a work-related entity in order to shape the state of mind of another individual, such as a customer. Emotional labor applies when, say, a restaurant server is told by their manager to put on a smile to serve a rude customer, not when a friend feels overloaded by another friend's emotional needs. In a more extreme example, emotional labor might be the work an employee is forced to do to swallow their feelings about a racist or sexist comment in the workplace to avoid alienating coworkers, superiors, or customers. It's an easy mistake to make, but it's also crucial to know the difference, as the term emotional labor gets at the heart of a complex system of capitalism, wherein workers are unable to separate their unique personal feelings from their work lives. The distinction between Hochschild's definition of emotional labor and its common misidentification might seem trivial, but as labor relations in the US appear to be on the decline, it's particularly important not to conflate individual problems with structural ones. In other words, it's okay to need space from emotional demands, but it's also okay to just say that. I honestly couldn't have put it better myself. Emotional labor is relevant, but Alex's power of empathy isn't about emotional labor in and of itself. Emotional labor is alluded to a little bit in the game when Jed says,
I've always believed that the role of the bartender is to shut up and listen.
But this is taken for granted. In fact, a bartender is not a therapist, and the expectation for them to be one is a type of emotional labor, which is totally unfair and unnecessary. Bartenders are people with their own emotions and lives, not vessels for our emotions, and they aren't paid to listen to our problems, but for some reason we have normalized this expectation. In True Colors, we might also consider Eleanor attempting to hide her dementia, or Charlotte trying to conceal her grief from their respective customers as emotional labor. It's an expression of the expectation that we must regulate our emotions and appear personable at work. But while the game never explores emotional labor much further than that, it does explore the idea of empathy as a kind of racialized and gendered labor. This is why we think that social reproduction is a useful framework to help us unpack this. Empathy is a part of the work of social reproduction, and is organized in gendered and racialized terms. Within a nuclear family, for example, a mother is not only expected to take up domestic labor, but a certain empathetic labor. She must tend to the emotional needs of her spouse and children. In caring professions like nursing or teaching, a certain level of empathy is also part of the job. We also know that the expectations of emotional regulation are tenfold for women of color, though this can vary a lot depending on particular stereotypes and cultural norms. For example, Black women often feel the pressure to avoid appearing angry, and Asian women are expected to be docile and self-sacrificing, and in different ways both experience the affective demand to withhold, regulate, and sacrifice their emotions and needs. Think of the paradigm of white women's tears. When a woman of color stands up for herself, expresses her emotions, or calls out racism, a white woman can, and often will, recenter her own emotions by literally crying or simply acting hurt or victimized. Her feelings of white guilt are centered and prioritized over women of color's experience of trauma. Tending to one another's emotional needs is a kind of social reproduction labor, just as domestic labor is, because in order to replenish our labor power and go to work the next day, we need to receive some kind of empathy, particularly when capitalist labor is so alienating and dehumanizing. Think about talking to a friend about a hard day at work, or working through personal and emotional problems outside of work so that when you do return, you can put your feelings aside for 8 hours or more. Empathy, like all social reproduction, is women's work. Women are socially constructed as more empathetic than men, and are expected to do this work. Of course, we are describing structures of power and not hard and fast rules that have no exceptions, but this is the one time that I will include that as a disclaimer. Men who experience alienation at work are supposed to come home and experience empathy from women, but who extends empathy to the women whose work it is to empathize? While the term emotional labor can be misleading and we will avoid using it out of its original context here, it is important to recognize that empathy is work. As we've discussed, lines between work and non-work, production and social reproduction, and alienated and fulfilling labor are not always so binary or clear-cut as that. Empathy can be incredibly fulfilling, important work. Like a lot of social reproduction, it may be necessary to uphold capitalism, but it also has the radical potential to overthrow it. But empathy is something that you do as much as it is something you feel, and this couldn't be truer in Life is Strange: True Colors. Alex cannot escape her power of empathy, the ability to hear and see people's thoughts and feelings wherever she goes. But you, the player, can still make choices which are empathetic or which aren't. In episode 2, for example, even after understanding and feeling how afraid Mac is, you can either calm him down or let him suffer. In this way, it's clear that empathy is not just a feeling or a state of being. It is an action, and it is work.
So if Alex's empath power is a clear metaphor for a character trait of being self-sacrificing to a fault, where did the power come from? Particularly in episode 5 of Life is Strange: True Colors, we see into Alex's past to understand how she got to this point. We know that a lot of social reproduction takes place within the sphere of the nuclear family. The traditional two-parent family structure stipulates that the father must do masculine-coded productive work outside the home, while the mother must do feminine-coded reproductive work within the home. cooking, cleaning, childcare, and empathetic labour. While we might be tempted to think of Western cultures as more progressive because more inclusive, not only is it important to remember that the nuclear family was imposed by Western colonialism on many non-Western cultures, but to be aware that the nuclear family structure is still very much alive and kicking here. The two-parent nuclear family structure hasn't changed much. The two parents could be of the same gender, and they might split productive and reproductive work more equally, or may hire others to do reproductive work for them. But the family structure is much the same. Relations of production, as we've already mentioned, are simply being further and further displaced. Not so progressive if you ask me. Where we see disturbances and moments of resistance in this structure is less in the respectable gay middle-class two-parent household, and more in racialized and working-class communities, where a single mother might be supported by extended family and neighbors and resources are pooled in order for the village to raise the child. The Chen family in Life is Strange True Colors is very much a singular two-parent household unit. John Chen, the father, is a manual laborer responsible for making wages to pay for everything the family needs. Meanwhile, Wendy Chen, the mother, is solely responsible for the reproductive labor in the house. When Wendy passes away, these responsibilities pass on to Alex, her daughter. Alex becomes responsible for cooking, cleaning, laundry, and, importantly, the emotional role of peacekeeper. It doesn't occur to either John or Gabe, granted that Gabe is only a child himself, that this is far too much for a young girl, or any person really, to take on alone. But even John's position is worth empathizing with. Because he is unable to keep up with bills, no doubt in part due to medical expenses related to Wendy's illness and death, he needs to work relentlessly on undoubtedly poor income from manual labor. Even if he had been taught that a man should be just as responsible for domestic and caring labor as a woman, he doesn't have the time or energy to give. He certainly doesn't have the money to employ someone else to help. The exploitation of migrant manual labor in the US is something that has been going on for centuries, and there are specific links between Chinese and Chinese American labor and the mining industry. In the 1800s, many Chinese laborers came to the US in the gold and silver rush. Remember, Haven was a silver mining town before it turned to uranium, and were quickly employed as they were willing to work longer hours for less pay than white American and Latino workers. This led to widespread labor unrest motivated by anti-Chinese sentiment. Riots in San Francisco, Rock Springs, Wyoming, and Denver, Colorado all led to the deaths of Chinese miners and their families, and the complete destruction of Chinese-owned houses and businesses. This widespread violence culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the country. According to William Wei's book, Asians in Colorado, after the Chinese Exclusion Act was overturned and the Hart-Celler Immigration Act came into force, Chinese laborers once again returned to the US. Between 1960 and 2009, the Asian-born population in the United States mushroomed from fewer than 500,000 to over 10.6 million. The history of Chinese laborer immigration to Oregon and Colorado could have been what led the Chens to settle where they did, and what led John to Haven Springs. For poor first-generation immigrants, the situation is especially difficult. In Carmen Teeple-Hopkins' interviews of Filipino domestic workers in Montreal, even though these women had migrated alone and did not have the family and friends they used to have in Montreal, they were able to find support for their various social reproduction needs in communities, specifically through Filipino churches and community centers. This can especially be a lifeline for undocumented migrants and folks who, for any reason, struggle to access social welfare. It doesn't seem as though the Chen family had access to any such community support, so when the matron responsible for social reproduction in their family dies, the family unit utterly collapses. This is unsurprising given the historical anti-Chinese sentiment in the northwestern and Great Plains states of the US, and the destruction of Chinese cultural hubs. Denver's Chinatown has still not been rebuilt since its destruction in 1880. Wei also points out that the model minority image of Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans has made it harder for them to access social welfare. He says, "The model minority image is just another social construction created to prevent some Asian Americans from obtaining assistance to meet their educational, economic, health, and human service needs. Even those who are considered successful continue to face a glass ceiling that has prevented their advancement, and they are paid less than their white counterparts with the same position in education." John is unable to handle the breakdown of his nuclear family, and of course Alex and Gabe can't handle it either, they're kids. While it might be easy to judge John for abandoning his children, it's important to think of the circumstances that led him to that point of extreme desperation. the complete inability to financially, materially, or emotionally care for his children. And when he asked them to call child services, who can blame him? We're always told that they rescue and protect vulnerable children, right?
Wrong. After Alex remembers her mother's death and her father abandoning her, she remembers her experiences of foster care. After her family teaches her to put her own needs aside in order to focus on other people's, in episode 5 it's implied that foster care is where Alex starts to gain her empath abilities. As she begins to feel others' emotions to the point of being overwhelmed by them and acting out, Alex ends up in group homes for so-called behavioral problems, punished for outbursts that aren't even her own. Or are they? It's an interesting paradox in a way. On one hand, Alex's empath ability is a result of stifling her own emotions, and she becomes suffocated by emotions that aren't her own. On the other hand, her empath ability allows her to act out and express emotions in ways that might not be totally healthy, but are ultimately an expression rather than suppression of emotion. In fact, the game raises a lot of questions about what feelings are or aren't Alex's. For example, if Alex absorbs Charlotte's anger, she has a violent outburst when she hears the call between Gabe and Mac. In this moment, could her own anger at Typhon and the injustice of Gabe's death be connected to Charlotte's anger, which she has absorbed? Charlotte's anger is also about Gabe and her grief over losing him. Is this an anger that they share? Further to that, in the dream sequence in episode 5, for the first time we see colorful auras around Alex herself, showing her emotions. Sadness when her mother dies, fear when her father leaves, anger when no foster parents choose her. Is there perhaps an inherent reciprocity to empathy? To share the feelings of another person, don't you have to be in touch on some level with your own? But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. In any case, building on her experience with her family, Alex's experiences in foster care teach her even more horrible lessons. That feeling connected to another person is dangerous and painful, and showing any kind of emotion is not only inappropriate, but warrants punishment. She not only becomes alienated from herself, but from others, because she is so worried about what could happen when she feels connected to other people. Let's talk about the US foster care system, actually. First, a brief history. Before 1935, orphans and children whose parents couldn't care for them were usually just indentured to work for other families, until, very much in the fashion of the Victorian philanthropist movement, the 1800s saw the founding of private religious and charitable orphanages. As rising numbers of orphanages were a cause for concern, the practice of placing orphans with foster families began. This was formalized with the first federal grants for child welfare services, which led states to establish child welfare agencies and local programs, authorized in 1935 with the Social Security Act. In 1967, Congress amended the Social Security Act, making AFDC, or Aid to Families with Dependent Children, foster care, mandatory for all states. Over the years, federal funding and oversight has increased. Between 1986 and 1995, due to public panic over drugs and the increased targeting of people of color over drug-related offenses, the number of children in foster care increased from 280,000 to nearly 500,000. This has only been rising since the intensification of the war on drugs from the 2000s onwards. Foster care is the system where a legal minor, a person under the age of 18, is made a ward, placed under the protection of the state, and placed in an institution like a residential treatment center or a group home, or the home of a state-certified foster family. Even if a child is fostered by a parent or family, the state stands in loco parentis, Latin for in place of a parent, to the minor, making all legal decisions on their behalf. The foster parent is just responsible for day-to-day care and is paid for this by the state. In exchange for federal funding for child abuse prevention and treatment, CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, requires states to establish child abuse reporting procedures and investigation systems. Along with the expansion of the foster care program, states' implementation of mandatory reporting laws in response to CAPTA resulted in rapid growth of the number of children who were removed from their homes and placed in foster care. According to the US Department of Health and Human Services, in 2016 the vast majority of these kids were in foster homes, with 48% in non-relative foster homes and 26% in relative foster homes, where a member of extended family fosters the child. Of the rest, 9% were in residential institutions and 6% were in group homes. A group home is a residential institution that houses at least 6 people. Kids in the foster system are generally put in group homes if they are deemed to have severe social and behavioral issues. Group homes provide a restrictive environment where children with, as the California Department of Social Services describe it, significant emotional or behavioral problems which require more restrictive environments, are supervised 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and are forced to adhere to a strict, structured, and punitive environment. Different group homes offer different programs, which might include mental health treatment, vocational training, and more. Many of these institutions list their function as reuniting children with their families or emancipating them, but this is rarely the case. For our UK viewers, think of something along the lines of the dumping ground in The Story of Tracy Beaker. In our video on representations of justice in video games, we talk about the concept of the carceral. Carceral means of, relating to, or suggesting a jail or a prison. So a carceral environment is one that resembles a prison. It's an environment that's restrictive and disciplinary, an environment of surveillance and policing that watches and punishes your every move. Group homes are clearly a carceral environment, and as kids aren't allowed to leave the group home, they're quite literally imprisoned there. The foster care system, like the prison industrial complex, as we talked about in our other video, very much creates a vicious cycle of violence that never has and never will fix the problems it claims it wants to solve. Most kids are in foster care for at least a year on average, and in that time they might be funneled through various group homes, institutions, or foster families. The carceral nature of the foster care system is definitely evident in Life is Strange True Colors. Alex consistently compares group homes and orphanages to prisons, particularly in her dream in episode 5. Remembering a particular orphanage, Alex notes the barred windows and the door locked after curfew.
Pretty sure it's locked.
Must be after curfew. We're not going anywhere.
Which obviously very viscerally resemble a prison, and Alex comments on how she was their property.
They should have stenciled the same thing on all of us.
You really feel like you were their property?
We didn't belong to anyone else, did we? They used to say this place wasn't a prison.
But clearly it was. Dorm rules also reinforce the sense of carcerality. Not adhering to strict schedules and rules will lead to disciplinary action and punishment, like when Alex has her guitar confiscated for an outburst. We know how much music means to her, how ever since her mother's death it's been a lifeline for her. So how is punishing her and locking her away instead of nurturing the things she enjoys supposed to help her? It's interesting to note a gendered parallel in that while Gabe ends up in literal juvenile detention, Alex is sent to a sugar-coated prison.
Like hamsters in a cage.
The image of incarceration occurs again when, paralleling the objectifying gaze of the therapist at the beginning of episode 1, potential foster parents look in at Alex through a window while she sits on a chair, like they're looking at an animal in a cage and deciding whether they want it. In a My Blog post in Alex's dream, Dr. Lin also compares her to an animal trying to escape a cage, urging her to surrender to the stultifying and inescapable embrace of our institution. She beckons Alex to throw herself into her mouth, rather than the outside worlds.
And psychiatry is clearly part of the problem here. In our video on women, writing and mental illness in Tell Me Why, we discussed psychiatry as a tool of control, and in our video on capitalism, alienation and disability in Project Diva, we discussed how capitalism makes us mentally ill. Psychiatry ignores structural, environmental and socio-economic factors like poverty and trauma that cause vulnerability and mental illness, instead choosing to individualize and pathologize our mental distress. Importantly, psychiatry, as opposed to psychology, though there are critiques to be had of psychology as well, is a medical model of mental illness which focuses only on biological causes. Biological causes are only part, not all of the picture. Psychiatric medication and the issue of consent is very contentious precisely because there are so many people that are coerced and even physically forced to take psychiatric medication. Sometimes this medication can make their condition even worse, and often it only serves the purpose of sedating people entirely, or just enough to work or function under capitalism, discouraging us from seeing the deeper emotional and wider structural causes and addressing them. So like toppling capitalism, building communities of mutual aid and support, and perhaps even putting time and effort into long-term therapies. We're encouraged to pop our pills and keep working. In Life is Strange True Colors, the opening sequence of episode 5 is a direct parallel to the one that opens episode 1, only this time the player moves from the objectifying and voyeuristic position of the psychiatrist gazing upon Alex to the embodied position of Alex herself. First, through gaining dialogue choices, which weren't available during this scene in episode 1, then through zooming out to take a look behind the camera, seeing the entire therapist's office. Dr. Lynn isn't in the office, after all. Her ghostly presence implies that her character represents something else, perhaps the institution of psychiatry and the institution of foster care more broadly. If you open up Alex's phone during her dream and take a look at My Block, you'll only see posts from Dr. Lynn. These posts are pretty similar to Typhon's and the police department's My Block posts in the non-dream world, only the subtext has pretty much become text at this point. But they're similar in that replies are disabled and the posts use the language of care. Corporations, cops, and psychiatric institutions all want to convince us they care about us, when in reality they just want to control and profit from us. We're going to be talking a bit more later about Typhon and the police and their interest in appearing to care for the folks of Haven Springs in a bit more depth, but this dream sequence definitely connects capitalism, policing, and psychiatry as part of the same apparatus of control. Alex's file reads, "Diagnosis? ? Perhaps this points to an important critique of the DSM, that it individualizes, reduces, pathologizes, and attempts to strictly categorize human behaviors that are, in reality, too complex to be contained by these categories."
God, they put me on so many meds.
Did any of them ever work?
Some of them helped, a little. None of them fixed me.
In their defense, mutant empathy isn't exactly in the DSM.
Gabe jokes that mutant empathy isn't in the DSM, but that's probably actually a good thing. Personal, generational, environmental, and socioeconomic factors are all responsible for shaping the people we are, what we experience, and how we behave. And how we interpret human behavior is different based on different cultural frameworks of understanding. For example, studies have shown that African Caribbean communities are less likely to view auditory or visual hallucinations as an indication of mental illness, and are less likely to treat people who experience them with fear, derision, or stigma. Throughout the course of the game, we see evidence that Alex has been prescribed alprazolam, a tranquilizer commonly known under the brand name Xanax.
Don't give me this any now or ever.
And that at one time she was on the mood stabilizer and tranquilizer lithium.
Don't wanna lock me up inside lithium.
And the antipsychotic aripiprazole at the same time. Using these sorts of drug combinations, especially on teenagers as their brains are still developing, can have incredibly adverse effects. Now, we know that Alex isn't really in a position to consent to taking this medication. In group homes, where she has already been placed for behavioural problems, trying to exercise agency over her body and her life results in disciplinary action. Refusing to comply with her assigned psychiatrist results in punishment. It's unlikely that she has been informed of how these drugs work, what the risks of these drug combinations are, the risks to her health as her adolescent brain develops, and so on, in order to make an informed decision whether or not to consent to taking these drugs. In 2014, the National Council of Disability and Conrad N. Hilton Foundation reported that after aging out of the system at 18 years old, 30% of foster children are diagnosed with PTSD, 50% graduate from high school, and 10% graduate from college. A study focused on foster care leavers in LA County recorded 65% leaving foster care with no place to live, and 25% incarcerated by age 20. In one survey of nearly 6,000 people incarcerated in the Kansas prison system, 20% had spent time in a state foster system as children. Children who grow up within the foster system are much more likely to be scrutinized by that same system when they themselves become parents. In Life is Strange True Colors, Alex's texts reveal a prolonged struggle with access to housing. In her exchanges with Mariella, or Mary for short, she asks repeatedly for a place to crash when houseless, particularly when trying to escape the group home. The first couple of times, Mary lets Alex stay over for a night, but the third time she says no, and then she stops responding to Alex. Alex's texts with Isaac, someone who keeps trying to intoxicate her and coerce her into sex, show that when Alex had nowhere to live and no one to rely on, she was extremely vulnerable and taken advantage of. Based on coinciding dates, it's implied that Alex only asked to stay with Isaac the third time around 12th of March 2018 because Mary says no, and the fourth time around the 28th of February 2019 because Mary ignores her. These experiences are not just based in misogyny, Isaac as a man taking advantage of her as a vulnerable houseless woman, but possibly in queerphobia as well. It's implied that Alex might have had a crush on Mary, and might have made a move on her when drunk, and that this is the reason why Mary stops replying. There's a lot that's uncertain here. Of course it's totally okay to feel uncomfortable when someone you trust and are trying to help makes a move on you, but especially if they are houseless and vulnerable, isn't it a better idea to confront them about it, let them know that they made you feel uncomfortable, and work through the situation, instead of leaving them without food and shelter? Mary may well have also felt that Alex only contacted her when she needed something, and took advantage of her. But Alex had nothing, and she needed someone to turn to and to rely on. She needed to know that someone would be there for her when she needed it, even if she had nothing to give them in return. Once again, she is proven wrong. When Alex is struggling to find housing, Gabe's search finally comes to an end as he manages to contact Alex on the 7th of February 2019, and on the 26th he asks if she needs help. She says, "No, I'm okay, thanks." She isn't. And the next day he asked if she would ever want to live in Haven. She goes quiet and he keeps texting, worried about her, until she finally replies almost 3 weeks later on March 16th. Then, on April 4th, he says he can't believe she's coming to Haven. Like so many other foster care leavers, Alex was in a situation where she couldn't access housing, and Gabe's invitation to Haven Springs, no matter how reluctant she is to accept the help, is the alternative to houselessness for her.
So how is the foster care system helping children exactly, when these dire rates of houselessness, imprisonment, unemployment, ill mental health, and poor educational outcomes are what it has to show? Some people, it's us, we're some people, would argue that the foster care system is doing exactly right what it always set out to do. Not to protect children, but to trap poor and racialized children and families in a cycle of poverty and policing. Let's take a step back and unpack that. The US foster care system is an enormous profit-making scheme. The federal government offers funding to states in order to place and retain children in foster care. The government or social services arranges the placement of a child, and the institution, group home, or foster parent is financially compensated. Governments even provide special incentives to facilitate so-called special needs adoptions, basically a euphemism for the adoption of disabled children. In a 2007 paper for the Southern Economic Journal, Brian Duncan and Laura Argus record that a $100 increase in basic monthly foster care payment to foster parents reduces the number of children in group homes by 28.7% and will decrease the number of times children are moved from one foster placement to another by 20%, revealing that many foster parents absolutely are incentivized for the wrong reasons, to make money. Duncan and Argus also record that children moved out of group homes are disproportionately placed with caregivers who do not share the child's race or ethnicity. Enacted in 1994, MIPA, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, prohibited states from delaying or denying adoption and foster care placements on the basis of race or ethnicity. However, MIPA did allow consideration of race and ethnicity in making placement decisions. MIPA also required states to recruit prospective adoptive and foster care families from different racial and ethnic backgrounds to reflect the diversity of children needing placement. Of course, none of this actually addresses the structural problem that leads to this issue: racial capitalism. On one hand, we see that children who end up in foster care overwhelmingly are from low-income families that would have benefited from adequate welfare and housing, but instead of federal funds going to such provision, they go into the foster care system to rip families apart. These families, disproportionately, are racialized. The 2020 report, How the Foster System Has Become Ground Zero for the US Drug War, produced by a coalition of organizations including the Movement for Family Power, the NYU Family Defense Clinic, and the Drug Policy Alliance, reported that between the years 2000 and 2011, 1 in 17 white children, 1 in 9 black children, and 1 in 7 Native American children were removed from their parents' care. This figure for Native children persists even after the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 required all child welfare court proceedings involving Native American children to be heard by tribal courts, and gave tribes the right to intervene in state court proceedings. On the other hand, the process of becoming a state-sanctioned foster parent requires a rigorous application process. The prospective parent has to take preparation classes and meet various requirements including an income check, criminal record check, a reference from a doctor that household members are all healthy enough to parent a child, and letters of reference from employers. In other words, only high-income families, usually white, are able to meet the requirements to become foster parents, while it's children from low-income families, usually kids of color, that they are adopting. This creates a power imbalance between many foster parents and foster children, which would be the case even without the factors of race or class. Many poor kids of color raised by rich white foster parents have spoken about the lasting effects on their psyches. So we know that Asian American kids like Alex Chen most likely ended up in white foster homes. This is implied in the game, actually. In Alex's phone, you can find texts dated 9th May 2016 from someone called Brigitte, who says, "Don't fucking think you belong in our family, bitch," and "Go back to where you came from," as well as texts dated 17th January 2015 with Mariella asking, "Did you ever figure things out with Miss Stevens?" To which Alex responds, "No, she's a bitch. I ended up back in the group home after that." In Gabe's apartment, you can also find a letter from someone named Ms. August saying she wasn't cut out to be a foster parent and apologizing if she made things worse. The content of these clues and the names of these individuals imply that these foster families were white, though this is speculation based on the use of Christian names, which might not be accurate, as we know plenty of racialized people do have Christian names thanks to colonialism. Still, it's likely based on the demographics of white foster parents versus racialized foster children that we've just gone over. In Gabe's apartment, you can also find evidence of his search for Alex, which includes contacting former foster parents Anita and Eduardo Morales. Alex remembers them as one of the good ones.
Anita and Eduardo. They were one of the good ones.
It's possible that the Moraleses were racialized South Americans, and Alex might have felt more at home with them for that reason. But of course, this speculation is also based on a very flawed assumption about their racialization based on their names, when there are, of course, white Latinx and white Spanish people. Those of us who have no experience of the foster care system are usually still at least tangentially aware that foster children experience a lack of stability which has deep emotional and physical effects on them. These kids will move between homes and institutions several times, affecting their schoolwork, relationships, and often creating feelings of abandonment and distrust. A foster parent could decide to stop fostering, the child could be returned to their biological family only to be removed again, they might be put in an institution or a group home for displaying mental illness or breaking rules, and then removed and then institutionalized again, and so on. I won't go into details here because it's deeply upsetting, but in spite of rigorous checks, there are various recorded cases in various US states of children being abused at the hands of foster parents who have had sometimes hundreds of children go through their homes. Besides from a few high-profile court cases, there's a huge amount of undocumented anecdotal evidence from individuals and communities that this happens to on a widespread basis. The same is true of institutions and group homes, though the practices of these institutions in incarcerating, surveilling, and policing children are arguably abusive in and of themselves. For example, Hawthorne Cedar Knolls Group Home for Girls, eventually shut down in 2018 for being a site of sex trafficking, continued to operate through years of parents and children protesting the facilities from direct experience of the abuse that happened there. In Baltimore, sexual abuse in foster care is 4 times higher than in the general population. In Indiana, children in group homes are twice as likely to be physically abused and 28 times as likely to experience sexual assault. Government programs supposedly intended to enable the independent living of youth leaving foster care up to the age of 21 clearly aren't working either. They don't sufficiently address the health, housing, or financial needs of youth leaving foster care, which could simply be solved through adequate welfare provision like universal housing, healthcare, and so on. Here we come full circle, as such provision probably would have helped their biological parents in the first place. Zoe Sigmund argues that the system is functioning as it's meant to, and explains that the state foster system acts as a secondary criminal justice system and uses drug allegations, including cannabis use, as a pretext to rip children away from their parents. The system operates on the process of determining which families are undeserving of state or federal aid. Those judgments functionally criminalize poverty. They shift the blame for problematic family conditions away from systemic issues of oppression and onto the individual. The system makes more money from keeping families apart. If families are reunited, institutions and individuals can't make as much money off of them. In 2016, according to the Office of Children and Family Services, Black families were 6.3 times more likely than white families to be investigated by child welfare authorities, and nationally, Black children are 2.4 times more likely to experience termination of parental rights than white children. Black families are more likely to be surveilled, more likely to come into contact with individuals and institutions that will report them to Child Protective Services, more likely to be investigated, more likely to be adjudicated as abusive and neglectful, more likely to experience temporary and permanent family separation, and less likely to receive supportive services. Erin Miles Cloud traces the roots of the foster system in slavery and in carceral justice. She links racist narratives constructing Black women as hypersexual and as inadequate mothers to legacies of slavery that policed and instrumentalized Black women's bodies. During slavery, Black women had no claim to their own bodies, including their reproduction or their children. White slave owners had a direct interest in claiming their children before they were even conceived, as a child born of slavery immediately became the property of the slave owner and could be put to work or sold for profit. The construction of Black women as inadequate mothers, unable to take care of their own children and blamed for high infant mortality rates that were actually the result of the appalling material conditions they lived in, was useful to slave owners, and this violent legacy continues to serve white supremacy in the US today. In Cloud's words, violent family separation, toxic stereotypes about Black maternal unfitness, and financial incentives for dismantling Black families are shared features of chattel slavery and the modern foster care system. In this sense, the fight to abolish the foster system is a reproductive justice fight. I would also argue that there is room to tease out how other historical legacies of racial oppression in the United States have come together with the legacy of slavery to form the modern foster care system. For example, as many Native communities have pointed out, it bears thinking about how foster care continues the legacy of the residential school system, which until very recently would violently tear Native children away from their families and communities, forcing them to assimilate into white culture and white families. Cloud notes that individuals who come into contact with the foster system pretty much always describe it as harmful. As a lawyer, she says that in 9 years she has never heard children or parents describe the system as supportive, with many explicitly denouncing it. Black families, even those who have trauma in their homes, often perceive their interactions with the system as exacerbating trauma, deeply traumatic, demoralizing, and destructive, despite the system's claim to the contrary. As both Sigmund and Cloud note, many states quite literally divert federal funds for welfare benefits that could support low-income families into the foster care system instead. Cloud cites that in 2002, nearly $1.2 billion of temporary assistance funds were used for foster care instead of being used to alleviate poverty. The system is not actually designed to support families, but to control and regulate low-income, often racialized families, and to encourage adherence to white social norms. It was created to socialize people at the bottom of race, class, and gender hierarchies, to hold the correct values, and to have the correct kinds of families. And it was designed to regulate Black and non-white immigrant populations seen as troublesome. Today, it continues to reinforce and recreate racial stereotypes and to promote the surveillance, supervision, and social control of poor, racialized populations. We've already talked about the carceral nature of group homes, but foster care more widely is very much part of the carceral apparatus of the state, which we talked about in our video about how justice is represented in video games. I know, you're sick of hearing about it. Every state actor, so public hospitals, schools, benefits workers, shelter workers, and so on, are legally required, thanks to mandatory reporting laws, to report anything that could suggest the maltreatment of a child. In fact, hospitals are deeply complicit in this sort of policing. For example, they can engage in drug testing of pregnant people and mothers without their consent to seek evidence of drug use and accuse them of child abuse and force parents into carceral drug treatment programs. Low-income people and racialized people are more likely to be subject to these investigations, and allegations could literally arise from anything the child protective worker fancies, from cannabis use to a dirty house to a lack of food, often things which indicate poverty rather than malicious abuse or neglect. Workers can enter home without warrants, strip search and intimidate parents and children, and decide whether or not there is probable cause that the parents are abusive or neglectful. Once accused of neglect, even if the case is dismissed, which many are, your name is recorded on a state central registry, affecting your ability to gain employment or gain custody of future children. This normalization of government interference and surveillance in racialized families, particularly Black families, not only creates harm for parents and children, but for communities at large. In 2008, research by Dorothy Roberts identified profound effects on social relationships, including interference with parental authority, damage to children's abilities to form social relationships, and distrust among neighbors, resulting from the government's intense surveillance. This leaves Black communities and families living in constant fear under the constant threat of violence, just as much as the police do. So, in terms of social reproduction, Life is Strange True Colors shows, first, that the nuclear family unit is insufficient to meet people's social reproduction needs. Unless a family is wealthy enough to displace social reproduction labor, including domestic and empathetic labor, onto others, poor and racialized families simply cannot bear the burden. Some migrants are able to find the support in wider communities, but for the Chen family, there is nowhere to turn to and no one to help them. The foster care system, too, is a failure in social reproduction. Or, perhaps more accurately, it is a success at policing, regulating, and controlling poor and racialized bodies, particularly those of mothers and children. In this context, Alex has only ever been the one trying to care for other people, but never receiving care herself, not since her mother's death. She has experienced systematic abuse and neglect on an individual and on a structural level. She has learned that the only way she can relate to others is by giving, but not by receiving. In Alex's memory, Wendy asks her to promise that she will take care of her brother and father.
You almost never cried, even when you were very small. Did you know that? That's been my biggest challenge with you. How do you take care of someone who is already so strong? No tears. my strong girl. I want you to make me a promise. Your brother, your father, they are going to need you. You have to be strong. Will you do that, Alex? Such a brave girl. How do you ever get so brave?
When Alex remembers her home life with John and Gabe after Wendy's death, she remembers
I tried so hard to keep my promise to her.
but her 11-year-old body just couldn't bear the weight. As John and Gabe fight, Alex desperately tries to de-escalate it, offering to sacrifice her own needs, to sell her guitar and her records, even though listening to records is the only thing that keeps her sane. Personally, I think one of the most powerful things about these scenes is the choice to place Alex and Gabe's adult bodies in the place of their childhood memories. The powerful, almost uncanny effect as they speak and act like children with the faces and voices of adults is that of two grown people carrying the pain, the vulnerability, the sadness, the anger, the trauma of their child selves. Throughout these part dream, part memory sequences in episode 5, Gabe, representing perhaps a healthy adult part of Alex that ultimately holds empathy for herself, keeps telling Alex to play her part.
You are 10, I am 14. Our mother is sick, so is our father. But it's a different kind of sickness. Play your part. You're 11, I'm almost 15. Dad and I are time bombs. You keep running back and forth, trying to defuse us both. This is going to suck so bad. Play your part. You are 12, I am 16. I steal a car and end up in juvie.
Gabe, come on.
Then you're 13, 14, 15. Orphanages, group homes, musty rooms in the strange houses of foster parents. By the time you're 17, you've seen them all. Somewhere along the line, you start to feel things. Your own emotions don't belong to you. You have nothing. No one. You are alone.
I don't want this.
Alex. Play your part.
He wants her to recognize that she's always played a part. He wants her to understand that everything their family went through isn't her fault. He wants her to hold compassion for herself.
Why?
You need to see it.
See what? That nobody picked me?
Nobody picked you. Nobody picked you. Nobody wanted you. Mom died. Dad left. I bailed. You couldn't keep us together.
It was my job to keep it.
You were 11 years old. You were 11 years old. You were a kid, Alex. Let it go. People leave. Life gets hard. Sometimes it's a big shit sandwich. Make it better. Be angry at Dad. Miss Mom. Hell, be angry at me. But don't give up. No one gets to tell you what you're worth. And no one can take your life away. Fight.
These very real, traumatic, emotional experiences, the messy, fleshy realities of life's work, have a deeply political and structural context. The structures that capitalism tells us it has created to take care of us were really created to control us, to limit us, and to trap us. But this is just the beginning of what Life is Strange True Colors has to offer us to feast upon for thought.
We've already discussed in a fair amount of detail the ways that gender, class, and race play into Alex's lived experience and use of her power. But how about the other residents of Haven Springs? Some of the choices in Life is Strange True Colors, both major and minor to the plot, have gendered and racialized implications for the people involved. In episode 2, we find out that Eleanor Leith has recently been diagnosed with dementia and has forgotten about Gabe's death and his memorial service. The player must decide whether to remind Eleanor of Gabe's death, a painful experience given how close her granddaughter Riley was with him, or, as the game phrases it, spare her the pain. Ethical considerations about whether or not sparing her that pain is our decision to make aside, this choice can play a part in whether Riley finds out about Eleanor's dementia, and consequently whether she decides to leave Haven Springs for college. Due to the nature of dementia, Eleanor will need care later down the line as her condition deteriorates, and this is why Riley's future is so entangled with Eleanor's care. Under a capitalist economy, it is assumed that Riley will become Eleanor's carer. According to Nancy Fraser in Crisis of Care, as money is the primary medium of power in a capitalist economy, and women's labour is largely unpaid, its social importance is obscured, and it's naturalised as well as mystified with domestic feminine ideals. The naturalisation of social reproductive labour, like elderly care, is why Riley so quickly decides to abandon college to care for her grandmother. It's what's expected of her. Additionally, as the US operates on a private healthcare system, elderly care services are likely to cost a lot of money, and given how remote Haven is, they may be hours away. Higher education also costs an extortionate amount, so it's extremely unlikely that the Leith family could afford to pay for both. A valid criticism of True Colors is that, despite creating a very emotional and accurate depiction of life with dementia through Alex's empath powers, the game scarcely touches on the material implications of Eleanor's health on Riley and the family as a whole. We know it's a side plot, but this could have been looked at in more depth. Experiencing Charlotte's anger is probably one of the most powerful scenes in all of Life is Strange True Colors. This is also the only time we interact with anger coming from a major female character, aside from when Alex herself takes on the anger of others. The decision of whether or not to take away Charlotte's anger is directly connected to the naturalization of empathetic labor as women's work. Charlotte talks about how she understands that in her role as a mother, it's her job to be needed by her son, but also says that meeting Gabe gave her someone to need for the first time since becoming a mother. In a somewhat subversive gendered role reversal, he was able to fulfill her social reproductive needs whilst she was caring for her son. This is what makes her anger and grief so complex. Her boyfriend just died because of her son, and she is expected to remain calm and collected. We've seen it time and again where women are mocked and dismissed for showing their emotions, and as we mentioned earlier when discussing white women's tears, the angry black woman stereotype exists specifically to demonize black women who allow themselves to feel, to be human. As Jess Joho for Mashable put it, similar to its more nuanced portrayal of empathy, True Colors is emotionally honest in a way few video games are, allowing its characters to feel the ugliest parts of grief that we're often too ashamed to admit to. Rarer still for a piece of popular fiction, it gives a mother character permission to express some of the most taboo emotions about her child imaginable, and it doesn't demonize her for being human. As Sarah discussed earlier, Charlotte's situation reveals a lot about black motherhood. Black mothers are constructed in society as hypersexual and inadequate in a hangover from chattel slavery, and because of this there is a very real worry that Ethan could be taken away from her by child services. As we mentioned before, black families were 6.3 times more likely than white families to be investigated by child welfare authorities, and nationally, black children are 2.4 times more likely to experience termination of parental rights than white children. Charlotte thinks of herself as a bad mother,
I'm a bad mom, Alex.
and suppresses her anger at her son out of fear of losing him, when she has already lost her emotional lifeline with Gabe's death.
Gabe, it's your fault. Why would you teach me to need someone again just to go and leave me all alone?
Charlotte's anger is rooted in the same feeling of injustice that Ryan feels at Gabe's death, but instead of lashing out and blaming others, she turns it inward. Her anger at the world becomes hatred of self, so much that she calls herself a monster.
What is wrong with me? I can't let myself feel this way. When did I become such a fucking monster?
Charlotte, like Alex, is used to sacrificing her needs for those she cares about. If you take away her anger, Alex's journal entry details how it hurt so bad, but she swallowed it because she had to. As a racialized woman herself, Alex is also judged and dismissed for feeling her emotions, and mirrors Charlotte's need to suppress the anger for fear of being seen as a bad person. When Alex lashes out with Charlotte's anger, Steph and Ryan leave her. When compared to Ryan's anger in particular, it's clear how gendered and racialized the experiences of anger, sadness, and grief are.
Whoa, that was heavy. This is all very serious stuff, but I think it's time for a generous dose of gay jokes. No, not us. We've talked a fair game about how empathy is a kind of labor, and we've argued based on theories of social reproduction that all gender relations are relations of production and all production is gender-coded. Where does that leave sex and romance? Alan Sears argues that sexuality is shaped around the relations of exploitation and oppression that characterize capitalism. That is to say, our experiences of our bodies and of our sexuality are connected to material relations of production and reproduction. You can probably already tell that this discussion of sex and sexuality is going to be extremely unsexy. While workers can technically claim formal ownership of their bodies, because they don't own the means of production, they are compelled to sell their labor power and engage their bodies in work. Workers could be considered as consenting to work, but are they really? Similar complexities are at play when we think about consent and coercion in the context of sex. Within structures of power that organize sex, such as heteronormativity and the nuclear family, while we technically own our bodies, we may feel compelled to have sex with certain people in certain ways, or at all. And while it might be easier to think about this in individual terms, it's important to remember that sex always has been and continues to be a part of structural and systematic control. From the objectification and exploitation of racialized bodies through colonization and slavery, including the use of rape as a weapon of war and domination, to the organization of sex work under capitalism, as Daz discusses in their sexily unsexy video essay about sex work in video games, to the policing of queer, trans, and disabled bodies through eugenicist policies and practices. Unfortunately, I could go on. It's no wonder sex is often disturbingly described as a conquest of the dominant over the subordinate, or, on the flip side, that colonialism and imperialism are often framed in gendered terms, the feminized land subject for the taking by colonizers. There isn't really any sex explicitly in Life is Strange True Colors, though it's worth recalling the text between Alex and Isaac that we discussed earlier, which reveal that Isaac took advantage of Alex for sex when she was houseless. A clear example, that, of what we're talking about here. But in the main action of the game, there is the issue of sexuality, and certainly the issue of romance. In True Colors, the player as Alex has the chance to choose between a male romance option, Ryan Lucan, and a female romance option that some fans might remember from Life is Strange Before the Storm, Steph Gingrich. You can also decide to avoid romance with either of them almost entirely. So, let's get into it. How are sex and romance represented as relations of power and production in Life is Strange True Colors? The question of Alex's canon sexuality is an interesting consideration to start with here, as it is in any game where you play as an established character with multiple romanceable options of multiple genders. There's a case to be made that because of the implications of what happened between her and Mari, that in any scenario Alex is into girls. But even if you dismiss this, these gameplay mechanics by their very function complicate the idea that sexuality is simply a question of being born this way. Alan Sears argues that sexuality is in fact both natural and social, that there is an element of deliberate choice in it. It's an interaction between nature and environment. Think of compulsory heterosexuality, for example. In this instance, heterosexuality is a choice that you are compelled to make, whether or not it feels right. On the flip side, you can choose to reject heterosexuality and make choices about who you date and have sex with if you choose to date or have sex with anyone at all. But it's our environment as well as our feelings that inform these choices. Are we safe to reject compulsory heterosexuality? Do we understand what it is or how it might affect us? Would we even have to make these choices if we didn't live in a structure of power, of cis-heteropatriarchy? Indeed, in True Colors, the player can arguably make a choice as to Alex's sexuality, by virtue of choosing either Steph or Ryan, or choosing neither. Alex is also given the choice to respond with yep, nope, or both when Steph asks if she's into girls. We're not in a situation where we're making a player avatar from scratch, so these choices interact even more so with the environment Alex finds herself in, and the sense of who Alex is as a character. So what are the implications of these choices? What do they mean for relations of gender, labor, and power? That's right, it's time for the ultimate showdown between Ryan and Steph.
Round 1, fight!
We're going to get Ryan out of the way first. There's no use pretending I'm not biased here. Anyone who's watched us stream True Colors on Twitch, or watched the VODs on YouTube, or anyone who's seen our rating of men in the Life is Strange series on a scale of assholery versus unaliveness, knows that we are not the biggest fans of one Ryan Lucan, but we promise we have our reasons. Ryan is Gabe's best friend and son of Jed Lucan, proprietor of the Black Lantern Pub, town council chair, and a guy who everyone recognizes as a hero because he saved a bunch of people in a mining accident, or at least that's what we're told at the beginning of the game. Ryan has a hero complex, not surprisingly due to living in his father's shadow, but Jed ultimately turns out to be the villain, and Ryan has to grapple with how his sense of self is so attached to living up to his sense of his father as a hero. Who is he without that? Honestly, I think that this is a really compelling setup for a character arc. I just unfortunately feel like it could have been fleshed out some more. There are a few plot threads I could say that about in this game, but no hate to Deck 9. We know that they were under a lot of pressure making this game during the pandemic, and they prioritized worker well-being, which is something that we totally 1000% unconditionally support. The romance between Alex and Ryan, should you choose this, is characterized in particular ways. And we all know that I didn't choose this voluntarily, so please observe a moment of silence for my lesbian sacrifice for the sake of research. First and foremost, it's clear that Ryan is aligned with staying in Haven Springs, which is the major decision that Alex must make at the very end of the game. In episode 4, if you meet Ryan on the rooftop after the Spring Festival, he can be found planting a tree in the Black Lantern rooftop garden, and tells Alex that it's a special place for him because he remembers his mother tending to the garden there when she couldn't sleep, and sometimes she'd take him with her. He then talks as though he's already assumed that Alex is staying in Haven, though when he notices her apprehension, he assures her that while there would be a place for her to put down roots in Haven, he isn't trying to get her to plan out her whole life. He encourages her to imagine staying there, and the player can choose to imagine Alex doing things that align with her own interests, like working at the record store or playing her guitar, or arguably things that align more with his interests, like working at the Black Lantern or hiking. When Alex reads his emotions, he's afraid, and he keeps telling himself to kiss her. That's a man's role, after all. If Alex and Ryan kiss, an aura of joy spreads into the world around them, and the tree that he's planted grows and blooms. After this kiss, Alex writes in her journal, "He told me I should stay in Haven, and when I looked down on Main Street, for just a second, I couldn't imagine anywhere else in the world I would want to be more. He made me feel like I could become a part of this place, like I could be as much a part of Haven Springs as the mountain and the lake and the Spring Festival itself. Like I deserved that. Maybe I do." And Ryan is further aligned with Haven Springs because unless the player specifically romances him and decides to leave Haven with him, he always stays behind. But why does it feel like, to become part of Haven Springs, Alex would have to lose a part of herself? I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but queer players will probably know what I mean. And the Wavelengths DLC, which we'll talk about later, depicts Steph struggling with a lack of queer community in Haven. Alex has never had a queer community before, and in Haven, it feels like she'd never really have that chance. We can still interpret or play Alex as bi here if we choose to tell Steph that we like boys and girls, but why does it feel like choosing heterosexuality? Perhaps compulsory heterosexuality? Why does it feel like rejecting the queer part of herself? Aligning Ryan with Haven Springs can be read as aligning him with stability, but perhaps only the kind of stability that a queer person has to bury a part of themselves for, as he is strongly associated with a white, cis-heteropatriarchal idea of masculinity. It's sweet in theory that Ryan chooses to share something of himself with Alex, the story about his mother in the garden. In her journal, Alex writes, "I didn't even need to read him. One of my favorite things about Ryan is his utterly crap poker face." Being an open and vulnerable person in and of itself is, of course, not a bad quality at all. Quite the opposite. But understanding this quality of Ryan's in relation to others, especially women of color like Alex and Charlotte, casts it in a bit of a different light. By that I mean that while Ryan is wonderfully transparent about his emotions, his own emotions really seem to be the only ones he thinks about. I hate to say it, I don't, but it's giving nice guy energy. In spite of his charming puppy dog face, on various occasions throughout the game, Ryan centers his own emotions over Alex's, and in episode 2 over Charlotte's as well. When Gabe dies, his texts read, "Alex, I'm so sorry. I should have saved him. I don't know what to say." Then, after his outburst at Gabe's wake, "Hey, that was terrible. You shouldn't have had to see that. I know you're going through a lot, but can we talk? I know it's asking a lot, but I think I really need to talk to you." These exchanges quite blatantly prioritize his needs and demand labor from Alex in order to meet those needs. Alex at this early point in the game being a person he barely knows. The end of episode 2, when Alex does go talk to Ryan, is dominated by his emotions and his needs again, and Alex is acting to meet them. Working through Ryan's anger in this moment, and I use the word work deliberately again as this is work that Alex has to do, is immediately followed by feeling Ryan's joy and telling him about her power, something which the player has no choice in. I'm gonna be honest and say that I just don't know how to read this transition. It honestly feels a little uncomfortable to me, and it doesn't sit quite right in the context of everything else about Ryan and his relationship with Alex, a relation of unequally distributed, gendered, and racialized labor. But if you have any thoughts on the scene where Alex learns she can feel people's joy, do let us know in the comments. The kicker is that in the town council meeting in episode 5, Ryan can choose to believe Jed over Alex, and regardless of everything you go through with him, including whether or not you romance him, he will choose based on whether a majority of people do or don't take Alex's side at the town council. That is, he will just follow popular opinion. And after the meeting, his texts offer a long explanation of his own complicated feelings without really asking about or engaging with Alex's at all, which sucks in either scenario, but is especially raw if he has just stabbed her in the back. Centering his own needs and exploiting the labor of a queer woman of color is one, but there are other ways that Ryan performs and enacts masculinity as power. First, he tends towards anger over Gabe's death. Unlike Steph, who tends towards sadness, but we'll get into that later. Charlotte also feels anger at Gabe's death, but the way that Ryan and Charlotte behave and the way they relate to their anger is extremely different, as Daz talked about earlier. In her journal, Alex says that Ryan is angry at himself, and describes his anger like an animal ready to eat him. But unlike Charlotte, who over-internalizes her anger, Ryan over-externalizes it. He acts out at Gabe's funeral, causing a scene by getting angry at Mac, completely failing to think about how this will affect those around him, including Gabe's girlfriend and sister, who simply watch on in uncomfortable silence until Charlotte just can't take it anymore. But Charlotte immediately tries to de-escalate the situation, thinking of others in spite of her own anger. In episode 3, when Ryan hears Gabe's call, he's sparked to anger again, this time directed at Typhon. Anger can certainly be a useful and healthy emotion because it usually comes from a sense of injustice, feeling that you or someone else has been wronged or a boundary has been crossed, and feeling the unfairness of it. But how we direct and use anger, how we behave when we're angry, is really important. Ryan consistently acts out in anger, unthinking of his effect on other people. Even directing his anger at Typhon ultimately allows him to feed his hero complex. If he can be the guy to figure everything out, to save the day, maybe that'll make him feel less angry at himself. And I won't lie, in episode 2 when he acted out at Gabe's funeral and on the cliff, I recoiled. His body language was aggressive and dangerous, and I felt threatened. We all know what violence so many men in this world are capable of in anger, and it's far too normalized. So it feels clear that what Ryan wants, knowingly or not, based on the way he behaves, is not a reciprocal relationship with Alex. He wants Alex to support him, but he is not really ready, willing, or able to support Alex in anywhere near the same way. He demands labor from her in the form of empathy, but does not offer it in return, especially not when push comes to shove. This, coupled with his desire to perform a heroic masculinity and his aggressive, selfish behavior, leads to a sort of paradox where he both wants to be Alex's white savior and demands empathetic labor from her constantly. Or maybe this isn't a paradox at all. White saviorism has always been about a self-satisfying performance and never about the real needs or agency of racialized people anyway. Complicated racialized and gender dynamics are of course typical in any interracial relationship, especially heterosexual ones, and this case is no exception. The white man and East Asian woman dynamic, where the white man inevitably expects servitude from the Asian woman who he expects to be docile based on racial tropes, is a well-known dynamic. Needless to say, we're talking about structures of power, and there are individual couples who do confront these power imbalances and work to address them. But this is definitely not the case in the example of Alex and Ryan. Ryan's aggressive, demanding, white saviorist masculinity takes advantage of Alex and reinforces her trauma. Ryan already expects Alex to do gendered reproductive forms of labor, in this case specifically to cater to his emotional needs, for nothing in return. One can't help but think that the tree that grows in the rooftop garden would bear the same rot that the Chen family did, and that one day it would simply fall apart.
Round 2, fight!
Now, what about Steph? Some of you will have recognized Steph from her appearance as a forgettable minor character in Life is Strange Before the Storm. Sorry, wrong video and a very, very wrong opinion. In fact, whoever saw us co-streaming the announcement for True Colors will have caught me crying and screaming when Deck 9 revealed not only that she would be in the game, but that she would be a romanceable option. Happy crying, to be clear. Again, I'm not going to pretend that I don't have a bias here, but having a bias doesn't make us incapable of constructing arguments based on evidence. If it did, human beings simply wouldn't be able to argue anything. Hate to break it to some folks, but there is no such thing as objectivity. But I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think we have reactions, instincts, and feelings for a reason, and so many researchers let that inform our choices about what to research and what angle to take. When it comes to analyzing texts like video games, our own personal experiences and histories collide or come into gentler contact with the text and its meanings. In other words, if Ryan made me uncomfortable or Steph or Alex made me feel seen, it isn't just because of my own baggage, it's because of something in the text that triggered it. And that can be a valuable and important starting point for textual analysis. But I digress, which is what I do best. Of course, in Before the Storm, Steph lived in the not-so-sleepy town of Arcadia Bay and went to Blackwell Academy with her best friend Mikey and the one and only Chloe Price. In True Colors, set 6 years after the events of Before the Storm and 4 years after the events of Life is Strange, Steph has long since left Arcadia Bay and is now the resident of another small town, Haven Springs, working at the local Rocky Mountain Traders record store and KRCT radio station. If Ryan's fatal flaw is his hero complex, Steph's, as explored further in the Wavelengths DLC, where the player steps out of Alex's shoes and into Steph's, is an abandonment complex. We discover that Steph ended up in Haven after spending some time in Seattle and touring with her now ex-girlfriend Izzy as part of their two-piece band, Drugstore Makeup. Gabe invites Steph and Izzy to do a show in Haven Springs, and when they break up and Steph isn't sure what comes next, he invites Steph to stay a while. He helps her get a job at the local record store and radio station where she makes a name for herself not only for her impeccable taste in music and her razor-sharp wit, but for telling fortunes with her trusty D20 in hand. While living in Haven and isolated from the rest of the world and the life she knew before, Steph has no choice but to confront her grief and trauma from events that occurred in Arcadia Bay in 2015. If the player chose to sacrifice Chloe in the original Life is Strange, Steph grapples with revelations about the abuse and murder of Chloe and Rachel, a close friend and a teenage crush, and probably her only queer community in Arcadia Bay. If the player chose to sacrifice Arcadia Bay, Steph is coping with the devastating effects of the storm on the town and all of the lives lost, as well as the personal loss of her own mother. Steph slips into patterns of overworking, bottling up her feelings, and meeting women online and hooking up with them only for them to betray her or for her to ghost them before they can. Eventually, Mikey, who she's been avoiding, undoubtedly because he knows her better than anyone else, confronts her and encourages her to face her own grief. She confesses that,
ever since Arcadia Bay, it's like the moment I start to care about someone, or someplace, that's it. It's a matter of time before I find something wrong. And I'm out.
By the time Alex arrives in Haven, Steph has lived there for about a year, has quit telling fortunes, and is already making plans to leave. Steph is obviously immediately attracted to Alex and is not afraid of making it known, but if Alex reciprocates, she is immediately nervous and afraid, something which feels out of character for her on account of her unabashed and confident lesbian swagger, compared to the awkward and nervous Ryan. Steph and Alex have a lot in common. There's surface level stuff like their taste in music and the fact that they both like to write it, but there's also much deeper stuff. As a radio host, and especially as a fortune teller, Steph is a listener, in the active sense of the word. She extends empathetic labor to others by hearing what they have to say, interpreting the role of her D20, and responding to their questions in an attempt to help them. How we define Steph's work is actually kind of tricky. Being a radio host and working in a store are the kind of jobs that have emotional labor demands. As a radio host and as a customer service worker, Steph must regulate her emotions and come across as especially personable and charming. But she also takes on empathetic labor by listening to people's problems and telling people's fortunes, though this isn't a part of her job description. The fortune telling involves empathy as labor, but it isn't strictly emotional labor. Though because she does it at the same time as her radio hosting job, the two do become a little bit blurred. To be clear, Steph isn't supposed to be doing the reproductive labor of listening to people's problems and giving them advice as part of her paid job. This is comparable to what I said about bartenders earlier. They're not actually paid to be therapists. A radio host is paid to read ads, banter a little, and be a DJ. A therapist, on the other hand, is paid to be a therapist. If Steph is a listener, however, there is a certain responsibility attached to this, as she is listened to. Her listeners may act on her advice, and it may impact their lives, for better or for worse. This, of course, is also a theme in the main game. Alex's power of empathy isn't passive. We've described it as labor throughout because it involves work. Alex doesn't just hear people's thoughts and feel their feelings. She deliberately makes choices based on this information about how to help people with those emotions. These decisions have consequences on their lives and on her own, for better or for worse, so there is a huge responsibility that comes with her power of empathy.
With great power comes great responsibility.
While neither of these characters share Ryan's propensity to demand empathy from others, there is something here worth comparing to his hero complex. I think it would be difficult to argue that either Alex or Steph have a hero complex themselves. While Ryan is angry at himself for not being able to live up to an ideal, with Alex, based on the way she talks about herself, it feels more like she takes it for granted that she's a bad, dangerous, or unlovable person, and feels that using her power to help others might redeem her somehow. While Steph is afraid of confronting her own vulnerability, or of it being perceived by another person, so she chooses to focus on others instead. Not to sound like an armchair psychologist or anything. The common thread here is that the desire to help others is entangled with, in this case, an inflated, deflated, or avoidant sense of self or relationship to oneself. At the end of the day, though, our relationships with others always have some sort of reciprocity. We are living, breathing, changing creatures after all, beings in perpetual motion that collide at certain times and in certain places. Trying to make a decision about how to help someone, as Alex does throughout True Colors and as Steph does when she tells fortunes, means assuming you know what another person needs. It means thinking that you can act on a static being or predict how a being of infinite possibilities will act and what infinite consequences could result. It means, on some level, taking agency away from someone, and it can be easy to slip into patterns like these if we are overly self-sacrificing, even if we mean well. What does this mean for the romance between Alex and Steph? How is their relationship characterized in terms of gender, labor, and power, especially in contrast to the romance with Ryan? If Ryan is associated with staying in Haven Springs, Steph is associated with leaving. She only stays in Haven if you romance her and ask her to stay. Now let's return to the rooftop scene, but this time with Steph. When you meet Steph on top of the Black Lantern, she's full of energy and she tells Alex she's planning to leave Haven and play music again. This is already of note because if the player chooses to leave Haven at the very end of the game, Alex leaves to travel and play music. Her and Steph have the same dreams. Where hiking, working at the Black Lantern, and living in Haven forever feel like another person's dreams, we already know that Alex loves writing and playing music. We already know that this has been her lifeline since she was a kid. When Steph says she's leaving, Alex is understandably surprised but can either act totally supportive or be a little bit more honest and say that as happy as she is for Steph, she'll be sad to see her go. Steph is a whirlwind, and I won't lie, I wondered when we first played this whether she was trying to run away from her feelings again. After the kiss, Alex writes in her journal, "Steph is good at hiding her feelings." But tonight I could tell that underneath the genuine excitement was a vein of anxiety, a tiny voice whispering, "You have to deal with whatever comes after." Certainly this is a Steph that has learned a lot from her year in Haven Springs, as we see in the DLC. This is a Steph that still wants adventure, but knows she shouldn't run away from herself or her feelings anymore. In Wavelengths, we see her ghosting people so she doesn't have to lose them. In True Colors, she's ready to commit to Alex, even to be vulnerable with her, and is working to accept the consequences that would come with that. Of course, Wavelengths revealed that Steph was already planning on leaving, so it can't be that she's running away from her grief over Gabe or her feelings for Alex, which she does confess here on the rooftop. More than that, she asks Alex to leave with her. So while it's tempting to see Steph's wandering lifestyle as embodying instability, as opposed to the stability of staying in Haven, there's an emotional stability here that Ryan, though offering physical stability, just wouldn't be able to offer. Partly in jest, Steph asks Alex to help imagine her new life in Berlin, Salem, or the bottom of the ocean, but she doesn't assume that Alex will be a part of the picture, only asks her if she wants to be. She tells Alex how she feels, but she waits for her to reciprocate, or to choose not to. If Alex kisses Steph, an aura of joy surrounds them and bursts into the world. This time it paints the sky a glorious purple. Instead of representing roots, like Ryan, Steph represents endless possibility. On the rooftop, she tells Alex,
"I don't want to pressure you, but I've seen you give so much of yourself to make sure other people get what they need. And I guess I wonder if you've thought about what you need."
This isn't the first time that Steph not only notices this about Alex, but acts in a way which encourages her to think about and prioritize her own needs. After the town council meeting, for example, Steph texts, "Alex, you are incredible and I'm here for you no matter what. Call me the minute you need anything." To which Alex replies, "I know. Thank you for having my back. It meant so much." And she says this in every scenario, regardless of whether you romance her or not, regardless of whether you romance Ryan or not, regardless of the popular vote at the town council. While Ryan's support is dependent on that of others, Steph's is unwavering. She truly does believe and support Alex no matter what. Importantly, Steph has her boundaries. If you choose to take Charlotte's anger in episode 3, Alex returns to her apartment, where Ryan and Steph are waiting to show her a recording of the call between Mac and Gabe when Gabe asked for the mining blast to be called off. Having just absorbed Charlotte's anger, Alex has a physical outburst and throws a bottle against a wall just past Steph. And while Ryan is eerily calm, possibly from his own actions, thinking that such displays of anger are acceptable even when such violence can hurt people, Steph isn't having any of it. She immediately removes herself from what is, quite simply, a dangerous situation. And yet later, at the Spring Festival, she readily forgives Alex when she apologizes, probably realizing that this is out of character for her, and perhaps even considering how Alex's empath power works. Steph is both able to stand her ground and to extend her empathy. Now, we talked about Ryan's anger, at himself for failing to meet an impossible standard, at Typhon, and at the injustice of Gabe's death. And we talked about how poorly he manages and behaves in his anger. But while Ryan's grief is consistently associated with anger, Steph's is associated with sadness. In episode 2, in possibly one of my favourite moments in the game, let alone between these two characters, while Ryan is preoccupied with lashing out at Mac and causing a scene at Gabe's wake, Alex quickly and quietly leaves. Steph is the only one who notices and goes to check on her, telling her,
"It's not your job to keep it together."
With the wake ruined by Ryan and Mac's pissing contest, Alex welcomes Steph into her apartment, and they sort of have their own wake, sharing memories of Gabe inspired by everything that surrounds them in the apartment where he once lived. Reminded of how Gabe encouraged her to stay in Haven Springs over a bet about who could win a game of foosball, Steph is overcome by her sorrow. At first, Alex steps away, afraid of being overcome by it as well, but then reminds herself that she's safe and wonders if she can help Steph. She uses her power to figure out what exactly Steph is remembering and to think of a way to cheer her up, deciding on a foosball game in honor of Gabe. In her journal, Alex writes that Steph's sadness was born out of love, and if in episode 1 the player chose to tell Gabe about her power, that Gabe was right. It is a gift to connect to someone. In episode 3, if Alex chooses not to take Charlotte's anger and Steph and Ryan stay in the apartment, you can see their feelings about the recording of the call. While Ryan reacts to Gabe's call with anger, thinking about getting back at Typhon, Steph reacts with sadness, lamenting the loss of Gabe's life. Now, both anger and sadness are natural parts of grief, but there's an interesting gendered split here. Steph's sadness is concerned with the loss of Gabe and the deep pain and sorrow caused by that, while Ryan's anger, though partly self-directed, is concerned with blaming someone for Gabe's death and acting out aggressively to that end. As we discussed before, this sort of aggression is naturalized for men, but not for women. Meanwhile, empathy, centering the memory of Gabe and the imminent needs of Alex, as Steph does, is something which is naturalized for women. I say naturalized, not just normalized, because we are taught that these emotions and reactions come more naturally to men and women because of some innate quality associated with their gender, which is obviously a load of rubbish. Ultimately, Steph is a model for learning to move away from an overly self-sacrificing empathy to a more reciprocal empathy, where her own boundaries and needs become as important to her as those of other people. Alex tries to help Steph just as she tries to help other people, but Steph sees the deeper issue here, probably because she relates to it, and she wants to encourage a fairer and more reciprocal balance of empathy and reproductive labor. Yes, this is also an interracial relationship, but Steph does not exploit it. Honestly, I don't think I can put it better than I did in this tweet. The only really important Life is Strange True Colors headcanon I have is that Steph and Alex both listen to Mitski, but Steph would pay for Alex's US tour ticket and would simply listen to Alex complain about white Mitski fans without saying a word. Because of the lessons learned in Wavelengths, Steph is in a position to truly look out for Alex's needs in a way which isn't about feeding a self-serving savior complex, but about encouraging Alex to prioritize her own needs. She doesn't make decisions for Alex, she supports her unconditionally and keeps asking her and encouraging her to think about the answer to one deceptively unsimple question. What do you, Alex Chen, need?
And now, a word from our sponsors, Typhon Mining. For legal reasons, this is a joke. As we mentioned earlier, the two major plotlines of True Colors around Alex's power and Typhon's control of Haven are deeply connected. In an article for Rock Paper Shotgun, Alice Bell highlights that Typhon was pretty immediately implicated in Gabe's death in episode 1, saying that their logo might as well include "We're transparently evil" as a slogan. While it's true that Typhon's involvement in both Gabe and John Chen's deaths isn't revealed as dramatically as, say, the, spoiler alert, Jefferson reveal in the original Life is Strange, this doesn't make them an ineffective antagonist for the game. The sinister omnipresence of Typhon mining is felt throughout all portions of True Colors. Their inescapable stranglehold on Haven Springs has the residents and the player feeling uneasy and even surveilled throughout the story. Typhon is the allegory for capitalism at large that the Prescott family were aiming to be in the first installment of the series, and through basing this in the historical reality of US mining towns, they feel like a grounded and genuine threat. Typhon's relationship with Haven Springs could be described as that of a modern company town. Company towns were a huge part of US mining history and industrialization in the 1800s, and are starting to see a resurgence today in the tech industry in particular. But what is a company town? Traditionally, company towns, or one-company towns, were geographical regions where the residents' main employer also owned the majority of businesses and buildings. Many of these towns sprang up from mine operators building accommodation for their workers close to mining sites, as mines are found in geographically isolated regions that are hard to travel to. Although some company towns had their employees' best interests at heart, this model became very easy for corporations to exploit. One common tactic was to pay miners in scrip instead of money. This was a form of currency that was only valid for use in the businesses owned by the mining company. This form of economic control would make it harder for miners to seek alternative employment or relocate to a new town, as their earnings were worthless outside of a company town. This lack of mobility also meant that employers could underpay their workers and treat them poorly, because where else were they going to go? Now, as far as we are aware, Typhon doesn't actually own all of the businesses in Haven, but they are the main employer of the majority of residents, and could be seen as an unofficial or modern company town. The Center for American Progress says that modern company towns are characterized by a dominant employer that employs a large portion of the local labor force. They present an extreme example of labor market monopsony, compared with commuting zones that may be concentrated in one or more occupations, for example nursing, but not others. Labor market monopsony power, a concept pioneered by economist Joan Robinson nearly 90 years ago, refers to employers' power to suppress job quality and wages below a competitive level. This is a real issue in modern-day Appalachia and the Great Plains regions of America, which includes Colorado, where Haven Springs is located. The structures of modern company towns, like their historic predecessors, allow corporations to exploit their workforce with low pay, poor benefit systems, and violations of workplace safety. For example, the JBS meatpacking factory in Greeley, Colorado employed nearly 10% of the local labor force despite repeatedly violating OSHA guidelines, which resulted in the death of a worker after his arm was caught in a piece of unguarded machinery. In Typhon's case, this inevitably hits racialized people the hardest, as we can see from the deaths of Gabe and John Chen, but the exaltation of Jed Lucan as a hero. However, despite all of the atrocities that modern company towns commit, the relationship they build with the residents frequently creates a sense of loyalty. Small towns that are struggling financially will try to entice companies to establish themselves in their town, as the economic subsidies will help to keep them afloat. Residents are grateful to the corporation for offering them livelihoods, and corporations then exploit these emotions to demand further payouts and treat workers poorly. After all, who else would set up in a middle-of-nowhere town like Haven Springs? If the residents drive Typhon out, then who will pay their bills? Typhon's involvement in shaping the capitalist production in Haven is fairly cut and dry, but what about their involvement in social reproduction? To the untrained eye, Typhon's sponsorship of the Spring Festival and their slogan of Typhon Cares that gets plastered all over my block may seem like positive things. Just as the workers have placed their trust and loyalty in their employer, the corporation gives back to the community in a gesture of mutual respect and dependence. If only that were the case. Take Haven Spring Festival. In virtually every instance that we hear about it, we are reminded of the generous contribution from Typhon Mining. How nice is it that Typhon is sponsoring a fun community event? Doesn't it all seem like a distraction from the poor working conditions and the recent death of a beloved resident? This same tactic was employed by traditional company towns, along with news releases touting the benefits of life in company towns, photographic displays in company-published magazines showing happy workers at work and play, patriotic rallies organised by the coal operators, hometown newspapers well disposed to favour their major advertisers, company-sponsored home beautification, gardening and cooking contests, sports events, and leagues underwritten by the operators. This contradiction between needing social reproduction for capitalism to work, but also attacking it at every opportunity, is exemplified in the testimonials of striking railway workers in Paula Molinari's article, "The best thing I have done is to give birth, the second is to strike." Many of the reasons expressed by the workers for their strike action were related to their employer's lack of care for them. Molinari says that the workers seem to articulate demands expecting the same commitment and care from the corporation that they put into their work. Corporations will only ever commit to the bare minimum of social reproduction needed to keep their workers working. These demands for equal care and commitment will never be met. All of this contributes to Typhon building a positive image of themselves in the eyes of the residents, whilst doing the bare minimum of social reproduction that they have to keep their workforce believing they owe Typhon something. The posts on my blog serve the same purpose. Unlike other threads we see on the social media app, every post from Typhon has comments disabled. Typhon doesn't want residents to engage with what they are doing and how they are doing it. They just want to tell us that they're not evil and expect us to believe them. The lack of feedback mechanism stops residents from seeing any criticism of Typhon, which makes it harder for them to speak out as they believe that everyone is loyal to Typhon. This quite closely mirrors the way that Veolia, a transnational company employing railway workers in Sweden, laid off 250 workers via text message and concluded the announcement with, "We hope you have a nice weekend." In some cases of modern company towns, company-appointed officials have more power and influence on the everyday life of the townspeople than elected officials do. In the case of Haven Springs, it's the case that these people are the same. Sure, Diane has some power in Haven as Typhon's representative, but the true Typhon rep with the most power is Jed. His mutually beneficial relationship with Typhon has allowed the corporation to infiltrate the town council through him so that he can sustain his patriarchal hero complex. Typhon may not literally own the people of Haven, but when they have the town hero wrapped around their finger, it's hard to tell the difference. Company towns have been described as double-edged swords. For example, in the article A Double-Edged Sword, Social Control in Appalachian Company Towns that we've used as research. This very much applies to the reliance on loyalty in company town dynamics. Corporations build employee loyalty through appearing to care and through gaslighting the residents into feeling grateful for the most basic social reproduction attempts. They also build it through fear. This is where the carrot and stick approach we mentioned earlier comes in. Typhon is no different. Earlier we mentioned Typhon's sinister omnipresence in Haven, and in True Colors as a whole. This feeling of being watched, judged, and even punished is carried through in Mac's storyline as he is overwhelmed by his fear of Typhon and what they will do to him because of what he knows. So much so that he feels the only way to escape is to leave Haven entirely. This mirrors how undesirables, often union organizers, were treated in traditional company towns. They were physically removed from the town, and due to the geographical isolation of the mining areas, were often left to die. We of course see how fear can inspire loyalty in Pike's surveillance of Alex, and the major decision of whether or not to remove his fear. Alex's journal entry describing his fear mentions the horror of the witness. As a police officer, Pike is clearly enacting violence in his position of power, but this description frames him as the victim and as passive. Pike has his own violent power, but even he is petrified by Typhon. He describes Typhon as the devil that runs this town, which directly links to the tarot card we pull earlier in the game representing Typhon. They are the devil, obsessed with power and domination, and pursuing the same. As Sarah discussed at length in their video on justice, seriously, just go watch it, corporations and the police are both interconnected and woven into the fabric of capitalism. Pike's fear of Typhon will never be the same as Mac's, due to his position of power as a cop. Mac is a worker. He depends on Typhon for his livelihood, so of course he is afraid that they will lay him off, or worse. Typhon can use this control to get Mac to hide their dirty secrets. But Pike is a cop, a tool of the state. He may feel afraid of Typhon's power, but ultimately they serve the same purpose in policing, surveilling, and controlling the people of Haven. Finally, from a political standpoint anyway, we were both quite disappointed with the ending of the Typhon storyline in True Colors. Once their involvement in Gabe and John's deaths is revealed, Jed is put in prison and the Typhon CEO is removed and replaced. I'm sure you're all aware of how we feel about the carceral justice system at this point. It's bad. The game at large seems to encourage us to have empathy even for people who do bad things, like John or Mac. It encourages us to understand that people are the way they are for a reason, and they do the things they do for a reason. Understanding these reasons and addressing them, as well as encouraging people to take accountability, might be a better solution than simply punishing them. Punishment doesn't address the root causes or even address the immediate harm, it only creates more harm. Although Jed's confession scene is extremely cathartic and generally compassionate, it sets up for transformative justice and accountability, and then just lets us down. Jed just ends up in prison, and structures of violence stay in place and are reaffirmed. The replacement of Typhon's CEO is disappointing for similar reasons. So often when corporations are revealed to be doing something horrendous, instead of viewing this as a reflection of deeply ingrained structural issues, it is taken as an individual issue and the CEO or other higher-up employees are simply removed and replaced. Bringing in a new CEO isn't going to change the stranglehold that Typhon has on Haven and other small towns like it. And if we are taking Typhon to be an allegorical stand-in for capitalism at large, trying a slightly different flavour of capitalism isn't going to solve anything. We need to dismantle the entire system for any real change to be made. These events might be realistic, but at the end of the day this is a story, and if we can suspend our disbelief enough to be on board with superpowers, we can prioritise narrative meaning over realism. Life is Strange True Colours is a game about how our everyday experiences, relationships, and emotions are structured by systems of racialized and gendered production. This is shown through Alex's story, her relationships, the lives of Haven's residents, and Typhon's control over it all. It seems we can never escape the effects of capitalism, no matter how far into the Colorado mountains we go. But as we've alluded to throughout this essay, while social reproduction may be necessary to uphold capitalism, it also has radical potential. At the end of the day, it's about the things that make us human. Things like caring for ourselves and one another, things like community and joy and care. Capitalism tries to instrumentalize social reproduction for its own ends, turning it into alienating, dehumanizing labor, or into systems that police and incarcerate us. To bring back a very apt quote from Rathzel, Molinari, and Tollefson, used earlier, capitalist forms of production have been successful in colonizing our desire to do something useful and to take care of others. But we have the ability to reclaim it. We have the power to dismantle capitalism and replace it with systems of care and transformative justice. We see this in communities that reject the criminal justice system and practice transformative justice and accountability, instead of calling the cops or social services. We see this when folks bring food and necessity to those on strike or in occupation. We see this in mutual aid networks where communities help each other to access food and housing that the system denies them. It's poor, racialized communities at the forefront of this kind of resistance. A resistance that is about rethinking and restructuring the way we live, work, and relate to one another. If you're wondering what little old you can do, this is a great place to start. Ask yourself, who lives and works where you are? How can you build communities and work within those communities to reject capitalist ways of relating to ourselves and one another, and to create a more compassionate and more empathetic way of living? As Gabe told Alex in the one life-changing day they had together,
he told me that home isn't something you find. It's something you build.
Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a like and be sure to comment. As always, a huge thank you to our patrons who make videos like this possible. We genuinely couldn't do this without you. Special thanks to our ambassador tier patron Fizzlefer. If you aren't a patron already, please consider supporting us over at patreon.com/GameAssistYT. Catch us over on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Twitch for further discussions and conversations. And as always, thank you for watching and take care.